Well, thank you all very much for this opportunity to join you. I hope you're able to have a sandwich or a salad or a soup or something as we talk here. This is something that's a great passion to me and my team, focused on how do we do a better job of telling our story. So today we're going to go through a presentation that really kind of focuses on getting to know the media and then positioning ourselves in such a way that when the media calls, how do we have an effective interaction and connect with the audience through storytelling. So with that, I'll skip to the next slide here.
This, if you like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oops, there we go. All right, so the goals for this afternoon, to define the media, to give a little bit of a perspective as to what the media looks like today. The media has changed a lot over the years and is consistently in a state of change. To focus on the importance of telling stories, to use stories to actually get your message out and to connect to your audiences, and to look at what to do when the media calls, and then ultimately to let you know you're not alone in this. The CALS Communication and Extension Communication professionals are here to help, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can get into contact with us. So who are the media? So the media typically, traditionally, has been local and state newspapers, local broadcasters, so the TV, local TV stations, radio stations, public broadcasting, so that's the WUNC-TV and radio entities across the state, cable TV, which took off and has continued to explode and thrive since the 70s, publications, periodicals, some niche periodicals and journals or ethnic-focused periodicals and journals, and then a huge growth in digital social media. Interestingly enough, a lot of focus from our local TV broadcasters and newspapers, a lot of focus is being placed on their digital media platforms, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is the case. So if we look at this, one of the things I often do, and my wife thinks I'm a little bit of a geek when I say this, but I always, when thinking about storytelling, I go back to our state motto, esse quam videre, to be rather than to seem. So in order to effectively tell our stories, we need to be intentional, but more importantly, we need to be aware of how folks are consuming their information. How are they getting the data and the stories that are important to them, that help shape their opinions and direct their lives. So I thought it would be helpful to share some information from the Pew Research Center. They have a great annual series where they track media trends and information. And one of the things that I find interesting is when we look at how do folks most commonly get their news, get their information, the TV, television, is still where the predominance of Americans are getting their information. Interestingly enough, the newspaper readership has dropped dramatically. So in early part of this year, what was, through surveys, what was determined is that just 2 in 10 U.S. adults are often getting their news from print newspapers, which as someone who's been in broadcast, I grew up in broadcasting, you know, the goal of the radio stations and the TV stations was always let's out-news the newspapers. Not sure we were ever very effective in that, but what's happened is technology has advanced in such a way that folks are not grabbing the newspaper and that's becoming the main source of information for them. Interestingly, on this slide, if you look below the different types of media, you can see from a generational standpoint, newspapers are still being read, but it's an older audience. And as we look at, I've got 2 teenage children. My kids don't even watch TV now. It's on Netflix or YouTube. It's however they can get the programming they'd like to have on a tablet or their smartphone. So I think it's always good for us to be aware how folks are consuming their information. To kind of take this a step further, it's not moving, is it?
Huh.
There we go. This is just a graphical depiction. So since 1991, you can kind of see the trends. This greenish, kind of lime green line down from 2004 and up is online media and digital media, which takes the online to the next level, which is typically mobile, you see there's dramatic growth there and decline across the board. Digital media, the digital media reality is something that is fascinating. If we look at the number, and this data actually is it's from slides that we used a couple of years back, but if you look at this data and these statistics, 46 million folks are visiting Blogger, which is a blog aggregation site. It's a hosting site of different blogs, which tells us more and more Americans are getting their sources, not their news, from sources that are not always, potentially, journalistic entities. They are individuals. They are folks who may be self-proclaimed experts, but not necessarily following the same journalistic guidelines as our traditional media outlets. As of September 2013, 71% of adults who are online are using Facebook. I know this to be true, and I know that as soon as Dad showed up, my kids started checking out. So we're seeing more of the adult population gravitating to platforms like Facebook, and not captured on here are things like Snapchat. So the younger kids are finding new technologies and new platforms that are emerging all the time. But the bottom line is people are using social media. They're online with great frequency, and we're generating a lot of content. So the 2 bullet points down at the bottom of this slide I find interesting, and again, this is dated, but there are roughly 9,100 tweets generated a second, and 6 billion videos that are uploaded or watched an hour on YouTube. So it is a reality, and I don't think it's one that's going to change. If anything, new platforms will emerge, but that is our reality. So when we look at this and we look at digital media, how are folks accessing digital media? So this is an interesting graph. Roughly 66% of us are using both digital, the desktop, laptop, and our mobile phones. Out of that percentage, 56% prefer mobile platforms. So I'll give you a little bit of an anecdote here. NC State, not too long ago, we've obviously changed our brand and redid the university's website. It was designed with the mobile user in mind. It was designed for a mobile platform. Because there's so much traffic now, and because so many folks are using their phones to access the world, it's changing the behaviors of communicators and shaping how we develop and design and become more intentional with our platform. So I thought this was interesting statistics to show the growth over a 3-year period of time of the number of folks who are accessing information on the mobile platforms as opposed to traditional desktop and laptop. The other thing is when we look at trustworthiness and accessing information and people who are providing information, news information that's of interest to us. 6 in 10 Americans are getting news from social media platforms. So that includes things like Facebook, Twitter, all of that. So roughly 6 in 10 of us are getting news information from the social media platforms. 18% say they get it often. 26% say they sometimes get that information. So when we start looking at the types of information or the providers of that information using social media, so let's think about in the Raleigh marketplace, the News and Observer, or WRAL-TV, or Mix 101.5 as an example. They are using not just their the over-the-air broadcast mechanisms or the cable mechanisms. They are using social media to connect people to the stories. So they're using these as breaking news platforms. A friend of mine who is actually an anchor at a TV station here in the marketplace has metrics. So the folks in the field will appreciate this. They're getting measured on how many tweets they produce in a day, and how many follows and retweets and all of that. So it really speaks to even our traditional news and traditional media outlets are recognizing they've got to use these platforms more effectively because that's where people are consuming the information. What I find interesting is when you look at the the types of information or news that is of greatest interest, we will have most individuals will prefer to see what a friend has shared, because their interests more likely align with my interests because we're peers. So when we start looking at this, our traditional news organizations run the risk of they need to have their content shared by as many people as possible because there's an influence and a peer network across social media platforms. So again, just being aware of the surroundings there. Media, without a question, is in a state of change. 23% of Americans say, only 23% say they read a newspaper the previous day. This is continuing to decrease. What we're also seeing is that local media entities, whether they be TV stations or newspapers or radio stations, there's been tremendous consolidation over the years. So whereas growing up, my family was in AM radio, and I joked that AM radio was sort of the general store of the community. That's where the community would come to share information, to hear what's going on. In fact, my dad remembers interviewing Travis Burke in Pasquotank County many, many years ago. Extension was a part of a weekly broadcast through a local media outlet. Well, look, the media outlets, whereas they may still be licensed and have a local address, they may not be owned by locals anymore, which changes how they tell stories. It changes their investment sometimes and involvement in the communities that we call home and the communities that we serve. These are all things for us to keep in mind and to consider. The other piece, and the joke is, reporters are coin operated. All of us, to some degree, are going to resource or effort something that is being supported financially, that drives revenue or that brings some return back to the organization. And as revenues have decreased, so Craigslist is a great example. So the newspapers of the day made their money on classified ads in car dealerships. Well, something as simple of a concept as Craigslist has taken away the revenue that used to be associated with classifieds and has impacted dramatically newspaper revenues across the country. And as revenues decrease, they start looking at what are our highest cost, highest expenditures within our organization, and it's typically the newsrooms. It's typically the news staff that's covering certain beats. So I think all of us will recognize we used to have agricultural beats in our newspapers. It's been decades. We used to have, we still have through Southern Farm Network and some others, some agricultural broadcasting and communications, but it's not the norm anymore. It's not a normal part of news coverage. So as we think about connecting with the communities that we serve, we need to think that and keep in mind that the resources to help tell the stories, to shape the news in our local communities has decreased. The other thing that's changed is if we look at, so media without doubt has changed, but the state in which our media operate has changed dramatically. So this is information that's pulled directly from the North Carolina Office of State Budget and Management. And it looks at the projected growth of our state and in the areas that we're growing. So that dark, vibrant green is where we're going to see growth over the next 10, 20 years. But on the flip side of that, we're going to see continued population decline in a lot of the rural areas that we serve. So these areas that are highlighted in red will either show a loss or a neutral population over the years. Why is this important? Well, some of it is that, again, media is going to cover things or be involved in things that potentially provides opportunities for revenue, but if there's not a population base there may not be revenue in servicing that community, which impacts, again, their resources and probably shapes some of the stories they tell. The flip side, or the positive side to this, is that we are growing as a state. We are going to continue to grow, which is a good thing. Where we're growing, however, and how we're growing, we're not growing organically. Folks are moving to North Carolina. These will not be additional generations of North Carolinians. These will be folks moving to North Carolina that come oftentimes with not a lot of awareness of who North Carolina was and what made North Carolina what it is today. They're very interested in what North Carolina will become, but they're not necessarily as interested as what North Carolina has been. These are all things for us to be aware of and to be cognizant of as we think about communicating and engaging media and telling our stories. So the takeaways, and we've hit many of these points already, is that the media is changing. Every day there are new sources of information. Again, they may not necessarily be held to the same journalistic standards as traditional media outlets have historically held themselves accountable to, but there are many more ways for folks now to find content. And in fact, audiences are self-selecting their own news. They're finding the source, or they're finding the angle sometimes. And I know as extension agents, you guys run into this. We have a tendency sometimes maybe even to select the truths that we want to believe. So this is a challenge. The good news is there is still value, and folks still like to consume news and information from trusted traditional news outlets. The manner in which they consume that is different, but there's still a great place for media outlets and traditional media outlets to continue to play. As I shared the story of the anchor that's being measured on how many tweets and Facebook posts and likes, when reporters now tell stories, they're not just telling a story one way. They are responsible for telling that story, slicing it, dicing it, changing it, so that it can be told across a variety of platforms. That takes time. It takes energy, which means that reporters oftentimes may not have the bandwidth they used to have to tell as many stories, because they have to find the stories that they know are going to have the biggest impact, and they've got to tell it maybe 3, 4, 5 different ways. So as we're thinking about engaging and working with the media, how we bring stories to them, how we are mindful of, okay, they may need to tell this on multiple platforms, how we can help them do that will be of benefit, and I think they'll greatly appreciate that. And then the last piece is there are less newsroom resources, and there are less organizations now that are solely focused on local news, local story generation. Are there any questions from the team here before we jump into what happens when the media calls? If there are, please send them our way, and we will address them. Okay, so we've looked at being aware. Now let's look at being intentional. So when the media calls, how do we become a better source of information for them, and how do we leverage who they are and what they do to better highlight who we are and what we do? So we'll jump into this. The key thing I'd like to share, and some of these slides may look familiar. We had, I guess it was at last annual conference, we had 2 representatives from university, NC State University's media relations team, come and give a training on media engagement. So some of this may be a refresher, but I don't think it hurts for us to be mindful of this moving forward. But think of the media as a messenger. Reporters are not your ultimate audience. We need to do collectively in the college and across the board, because there's so many sources of information, we need to better understand who our audiences are and how we want to connect with them. What's important to our audience, so we've got to start from a position of knowing this is what's important to the folks that we want to communicate with. And these are the types of stories, this is the type of information that will help us in connecting with our audience. So how does this help extension? Well, it elevates. Anytime we can help tell the story of extension, we're elevating awareness for what it is that we do and why we are so vital to North Carolina, how on a daily basis, our work is making North Carolina better. It also helps us strengthen partnerships and builds community around different groups that we're serving. It helps us in the extending of the information. And it always should point back to how we are improving lives, what we are doing to help improve lives. The other piece that I think this does is if we're effective in working with the media and honing our stories and getting them out there, it'll engage and mobilize our existing resources and may even bring more resources to the table. So that's why it's so important for us to be intentional about developing relationships with our media and our news outlets and leveraging the communications platforms. So what is it that we should know about reporters? So reporters, their job is to ask tough questions. Some you may feel that, well, that's just their personality, and maybe it is, but their job is to be skeptical. It's to look for things and to dig and to confirm what's actually happening that's of relevance to the people of our state. Reporters are quick studies. They may not necessarily be experts, but chances are good that they can get a general feel for things fairly quickly and are very adept at translating that information, what they learn very quickly, translating into things that their audience can understand. So taking the very complex and translating that to something that's understandable for the masses. They live by deadlines. They're always up against some deadline. So be mindful of that. Be thoughtful of that. And I say this not to be mean, but just as an acknowledgement. Reporters can oftentimes be very friendly, but may not necessarily always be our friends. So just keep that in mind. What do reporters want then? Reporters want to break the story, right? They more and more these days, and maybe you would agree, we tend to talk about things that may divide us more, or the controversies that surround us, than thinking and communicating the things that may bring us closer together. But reporters want us to be open. They want us to be honest. They want a good story, and they want as many of the elements of that story as humanly possible. Whatever they can capture, they want to have as much of that context and that background to draw from in telling their stories. They want good quotes, good interviews with very knowledgeable and trusted sources. That's something that we can bring to the table. They want to be able to, within a 20-minute conversation, understand maybe something that's taken our experts a much longer period of time to develop or to create. They need to be able to quickly grasp it so that they can in turn translate that and get that out to their audience. I think it's important for us to think about what's news. News is timely, it's immediate. It's not history for history's sake. If there is a way to tie something back through a humanized story to some history, that's great, but let's not lead with history. News is important. It affects many people in some form or fashion. It's innovative. It's futuristic. It's helping shape and inform perceptions of what we can now do that maybe we couldn't do before, and why that's important. News is interesting. It's unique. It's a new angle on an old story. It's something that has changed. News is also real. I know from my vantage point, if it hits my wallet, it's probably news. Or if it impacts my kids or my family, chances are good that's a newsworthy story. And then oftentimes, news is what the reporters decide is the news. But because the diversity in the platforms now and the different sources of information, that's not as much the case as it used to be. So there are some compelling C's of news: crisis, catastrophe, crime, conflict, change, corruption, and then my favorite is color. And this, to me, is where clearly, in times of natural disaster, in times of of issues related to, I think of avian flu, I think of waste management practices, I think of storms that may be coming and the impact those storms have on our agricultural partners and that community. Clearly, we're a source, we're a resource, we're someone that can help in telling that story and creating the news. Likewise, I think where we could spend and we need to be spending, and what I'm charging our team to spend more of our time on, is the color aspect. How are we tackling some of the challenges of our day? What is it, if it's childhood obesity, what is it that we're doing to impact childhood obesity? What is it that we're doing to impact crop yields to feed more of a growing population? It's finding that human interest, being able to identify a specific story, a specific case in which we can point back to how we are making North Carolina better. So my encouragement is, yes, we want to be seen as a resource and involved in helping. When these C's come up, we want to be at the table. I'd like for us to be proactive and think about that human interest side, that providing the news, that color commentary piece, and the incredible things that we're doing across the state. What's not news? Well, what's not news is, as great as they are, the grants and the awards, that they're very important, and they're very important to us. And they may be important to a number of the stakeholders in which we engage and work with, but by and large, that's not news. If you can, however, after a grant, this goes back to the discussion Lou and I had, if you can humanize, because of this award, because of this grant, here's what we were able to do, here's how we were able to help change the lives of members of the community, that becomes news, that becomes a story. So the encouragement is, let's look at how we shift what historically we've seen as, well, I need to do a press release on this grant. I need to do a press release on this award, this program. Let's shift that a little bit to think about impact. And I know we capture all of our impacts and we store those someplace, and then we bundle them and we take them, to marketplace as a collective. Let's not wait until those impacts are all documented. Let's do a ride-along. Let's show the impacts that we're having while we're having the impact. So my encouragement and what I'd like for us to continue to think about is, let's not wait. Let's not make news or try to make news of something that's not newsworthy. And let's not wait until we're reporting on what's already happened. Let's look at how we're changing and impacting the lives of the folks that we serve. So let's look at why us. Well, this goes back to the brand, right? This goes back to who we are and what we do. We are knowledgeable, trusted sources of information. We're accessible. We're in all corners of the state, and you can find us. And we're visible. We're engageable. We are accountable through our land grant charter and through our cooperative partnerships with local, state, and federal governments. So one of the things that I know we've talked about is brand and branding, and I know that's. But the truth is, I look at it as brand's more than a logo. It's more than a document. It's the story. It's the story of why we exist and who we are. So all of us, to some degree, are storytellers and need to be storytellers, because the stories are just too phenomenal not for us to be out and telling them. So how do we get in the news? So a lot of these are traditional methods, the news release. And there's still value in news releases, but I'll share with you, I think that they need to be special. They need to be done well, and they need to incorporate a new angle, a human aspect that will get that news release off the desk of the assignment editor and into the hands of a reporter. We need to be more active in pitching stories and thinking about what we're doing and how it helps solve problems, and identifying possible clients that we serve and saying, would you be okay if we tell your story, include your story into the narrative of what we're doing? Again, let's not wait until something's already done. Let's think about how we can proactively position our stories as things are unfolding, as we're impacting. The other way we get into news is reporter queries and interviews, requests for interviews, and periodicals and other types of publications. So why I think we've hit on a lot of this, but I hope the point that's coming across is that the media still plays, and reporters play a very vital role in where they're focused. If they're reporting news and information that's vital to their readership, to their viewership, to their listening audience, we need to make sure that our stories are among those things that are vital, that they're incorporating into the mix of what they're reporting on. It helps us reach a large audience, not just, and again, I think we still have a predominance to focus on print, and print's still a very, very, very valuable connectional resource from a news standpoint. And what we're seeing is that those newspapers that are hyper-local, that are super local focused and owned by local folks, do a phenomenal job of telling what's happening in their community. But the broader reach is not just the medium in which they currently communicate, it's the social, it's the digital platforms. So they reach a large audience through their existing platforms, but even more importantly, through a digital platform. It's important for us to get to know and to work with reporters so that we have a relationship with them. My challenge and what we're trying to work towards is the media across our state should know who we are. We should have a relationship with them. More than just, hey, I need this from you, but to touch base with them and to determine how can we develop and nurture a relationship. We need to be seen as the experts in what it is that we do. And we need to demonstrate our impact on decision makers. So when a reporter calls, the first thing to do is to find out what's needed. What is it that they're looking for? If there's a specific story in mind, get the details on that story. Understand what their timeline is. What types of, how it's going to be distributed, what platforms they're going to tell the story across. It's okay to not have all of the answers, or to be able to buy a little bit of time and say, hey, now that I know this, would you mind if we schedule some time to follow up on this? What does next Tuesday look like? Or, again, know the timelines here, but if there is the opportunity to buy a little bit of time, I encourage you to do that. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important. The other is, if you don't know the answers, and not any one person can have all the answers and tell all the amazing stories of extension, or to be the right resource for that particular story, reach out to the network, the extension network across the state, to incorporate and to enlist support and assistance from fellow extension agents, specialists, leadership from across the state. Before the interview, again, we've hit on this, but really try to get a general sense of what is the story, what is the type of story you're trying to tell. Ultimately, a reporter will come to things with a notion of the story that they would like to write. Through their investigation and through their research, it may take a different angle, or they may want to report on both sides. But by and large, when they start a story, they've got a general sense for what that is. It's okay to ask that. It's okay to get a better sense of that. In asking that, you may be able to bring various points, not just one point of an issue, but you may be a tremendous resource to bring both sides of an issue together, which demonstrates tremendous value and is something that's very important to reporters. But always know, if you can, when the story is going to run. If you can buy that time, the best thing to do is to be very prepared. And what we tell folks is to have talking points. Have 2, 3. I'm a big fan of the rule of 3. Have 3 main talking points. Knowing the angle of the story, or knowing the type of story that's going to be told, demonstrate or pull together the 3 points that you want to make that tie back to information, that tie back to examples and anecdotes. the more that we can humanize, and by that I mean identify someone that's been impacted, or a community that has benefited from, or challenges that we've tackled in a unique way or a different way, bring those to the table and shape your points around those stories. Practice them. If you can find a peer or a family member, if you don't drive them completely crazy, practice them. Have them ask some questions so that you can be prepared with the types of questions that may be asked, and then you'll feel more comfortable at the time of the interview. Always expect the best, but prepare for the worst. So think about all of the variants of questions that may come up, and run through some scenarios to understand how you would address those. In telling your story, or in shaping the story, if it's an interview, if it's a print publication, or even through social media, images, anytime there is a picture that is incorporated into a social media post, the engagement goes through the roof. So think about the different images that tie very well to your story. And it may be an image of the individual or the story that you're trying to tell, the person or the client or the community that's been impacted positively by our work. If you can, have images that show action. Images that are headshots or a gathering of people, they don't engage as much as a group being involved in an activity, or bringing in an element of agriculture or an element of the world in which they operate. During the interview, keep it sweet, to the point, know what you want to say, and then after you've said it, stop. You don't have to keep talking. You don't have to fill the void, if you will. Stay focused, keep it simple. Be honest, don't ever lie. Don't ever put yourself in a position that you're not comfortable communicating something. But be honest, be truthful. The other piece that I would share with you is that as part of a larger organization, whereas all of our opinions are valued, there are times where our opinion is not the story and doesn't need to be the story. Let's be mindful of the organization that we represent, the work that we do, and then the role and the place that we play in that. And think about that as we're telling the story through an interview. The other thing is this off the record. It sounds great in movies. They don't like that. So assume nothing is off the record, and avoid saying no comment. If it's something that you're not comfortable addressing or answering, then try to bridge to a statement or to a comment that you do feel more comfortable addressing. So move from something that's a tough question or that makes you uncomfortable, and point back to the three main points that you've practiced and that you've outlined. That is probably the hardest thing to do in an interview, but when you do it effectively, it allows you to stay on message and to make sure you're being true to your story, and to make sure that you're connecting with the audience that you're intending to connect with. The other side of that, if there are questions that are difficult and you don't quite know how to respond, it's okay to ask if they'd restate, and it would be okay to decline. Say, I don't want to speculate on that. And again, bridge to one of your points, bridge back to what it is that you want to make sure that you're communicating. And the other piece is to always remain cool. I know we see things on TV where it's, I've gotten to a point to turn the channel on some of the cable news stuff where it's just argument to be argumentative. It makes people feel uncomfortable, and it doesn't always put our best foot forward in making sure we're connecting people to the information that we want to disseminate. After the interview, provide a card, provide your contact information. Once again, confirm when the story is going to be told. If you would, share that with your CALS Communications team. Share that with your extension partners that you work with. Share it with the extension community as a whole. We want to highlight these stories and to repost or retweet or make sure that the broader audience and broader network know about the great work and the ways we're making North Carolina better. Never ask to approve a story. That one, it's not professional, and they're not gonna do that. So avoid doing that, and always be available for a follow-up. Provide them a cell number, and be okay with answering their phone call if there's a follow-up question. We've had situations where after we've helped provide a couple of different sources, because we were trustworthy in helping do that, they came back to us and said, okay, help me make sense of what these 2 points are. So you'll be surprised at some of the follow-up, and if you earn that trust, you have that relationship to draw from, they may come back to you with a follow-up question before possibly posting or sharing something that they may still have some questions about. And the other piece, as I said at the beginning, you're not alone in this. We're here to help. So I've provided a couple of names here. So of course me, feel free to reach out to me via email or via a phone call, or Suzanne Stannard on our team as well. So we've got a question here. So Denise, how do we tell CALs about newspaper articles, etc.? So you can email us, you can call us. That probably is the best way to do that. And are you asking in advance of the article or after an article has been written? And if it's while you're being approached on the article and you want some guidance on that, okay, after published. If it's before the article, if you get a phone call and you want to run something by us prior to scheduling that time to speak to the reporter, by all means do that. We're more than happy to do that. If it's an article that's been published, if it's digital, email us a link to the story. If it's not digital, share it with us anyway, and we'll see if we do have a clipping. They used to have a clipping service where they'd actually clip the newspapers, and we'd keep the clippings. But we can, through digital tracking, we can go and try to find digitally those stories. But by all means, share with us highlights of any publicity and any stories that you're able to effectively tell in your community through newspapers or any of the media outlets. Are there any other questions? I hope I haven't talked y'all's ears off. I guess the last thing I'd share is we do have a page where we have communications resources via our website. That link is listed below on this last slide, and feel free to go check that out, to peruse that. And again, please don't hesitate to call us, to reach out to us via email. The other piece that I would share is that we are really focusing on improving our social media presence. We have hired a recent CALS grad that is, her time is being, she's 100% social media focused, a 1/4% on extension, a 1/4 for alumni engagement, and then 50% for news and storytelling for CALS as a whole. So we have a full-time social media person. Our platforms are growing, so you can find us on Facebook. I think it's at CALS NC State, or on Twitter, it's at NC State CALS. And we are launching an Instagram page in very short form. I'm not as much on the Instagram stuff as I am the other two, but we're trying to take advantage of all the ways in which we can connect with more of the folks that we serve, but more importantly, the folks in our state who don't quite know our story. And I think there's a lot of them, which is a good opportunity for us. So, well, thank you all very, very much for your time.